We're back. I'm Jay Fidell. This is ThinkTech. More specifically, this is our Transitional Justice series, which is very important to us. Today, we're going to talk about human rights and conservation, which is, part of the Project Expedite Justice array of things and interests and concerns and protections. We're going to talk about recent developments and pressing issues in human rights and conservation with Nicolás Süssmann in Bogota, Colombia. Nicolás Süssmann, it's so nice to see you. And I just want to ask, you lateraled over from some other things you were doing in Bogota for Project Expedite Justice, and now you're doing environment and human rights. Tell me about the transition and tell me what you do.
Hi, Jay. Thanks. And it's a pleasure to be here again. Yeah, I changed a bit projects inside PJ. We got this interesting challenge. We were approached by people concerned about indigenous people's rights, and they made us realize that there's a lot of things happening now with the environment, but also how these measures to protect the environment have an impact on people. And that's what this project is about. We care about the environment. We all want to hinder climate change, and we want to prevent the devastating consequences of climate change from happening. But what we notice is that some of the measures that are being implemented to do this, particularly the creation of protected areas, national parks, forest reserves, game reserves, and so on, is being done with huge costs to the rights of indigenous peoples, because usually what happens is that they are kicked out of their ancestral lands to set up these areas to protect the animals and so on, areas that are actually biodiversity reserves, because indigenous peoples have been there since forever, taking care of these animals, taking care of this nature. And now that we see the need to protect it, we're kicking them out and trying to fence them to prevent the biodiversity loss with the huge costs that anyone would face if they got kicked out from their homes,
It's so interesting that there's a kind of an odd intersection here, in the sense that you expect protection of the environment, dealing with climate change, helping indigenous people, helping wildlife. It's all in the same basket. And so if you do good in one of those things, you're somehow doing good in all of those things. But that's not necessarily true. There is a kind of conflict. Sometimes if you do good in one of those things, you're not doing good in some of those other things. It's very nuanced. It's very refined. It's very sophisticated kind of analysis of the world in which we live. Can you give us some examples of where you're trying to do it all, but it affects human rights in the process?
Right, absolutely, absolutely. So precisely what we're seeing is that in Africa and Asia, in many of these protected areas, you're seeing that. If you see Latin America, for example, we have natural protected areas that are also indigenous reserves, and indigenous peoples manage this, and they know how to live well with wildlife, how to live in a sustainable way, and how to preserve and take care for nature, because that's central to their existence and their identity, right? And that has been respected because how historically indigenous people's rights have been respected in this region. But then in Africa, that had a different colonial process, a bit more aggressive, and so on, what we're seeing is that protected areas are not being handled always by indigenous peoples. And what we have is a model called fortress conservation. And fortress conservation believes that indigenous peoples, not indigenous peoples, humanity as a whole, indigenous peoples included, are incompatible with biodiversity because humans are bad for nature and are a negative element for that. And many of us are. Many of our way of living is damaging for nature, but indigenous people's livelihoods are not. And that's what we're seeing there. So when they implement this fortress conservation, what they do is they find this land, they kick every human presence out of there violently many times. And then what you have is a huge human rights crisis, because you have very marginalized groups like indigenous peoples that are closely tied to their lands and to their way of living. And then they're left out, not properly compensated, not properly resettled, because it's not that any land is as good for them as any other. And then you create a livelihood crisis, a culture crisis, an identity crisis that you uphold through militarization, and that have indigenous peoples trying to go back because they're trying to go back to what was their homes, also trying to go back because they don't have the resources to leave. And when they try to go back, they face armed echo guards that just shoot at them.
Oh, no. Yeah.
Torture them, and so on. So it's a very dire situation, what we are seeing in a model that does not need to be like that, because you have examples in other parts of the world, and actually more successful examples of conservation and indigenous people's presence in the same areas.
Oh, wow. Well, it's got to be balanced. And I suppose that if you come into a situation like that, trying to do, part of it, and you're too aggressive, you are hurting people. And imagine separate, if you lived in New York, and for that matter, Bogota, and you were, asked to leave your house or apartment, you could find another place. But when you're indigenous, the land is your house. It's your home, and you're connected more than you would be in a big city to the land, to your life. And so if you exclude people from these places, you're really putting a tremendous oppression on them. And so that's over the top. It's really unnecessary, as you say, and it's also very oppressive. But what's the solution? I mean, it sounds to me like it's not the fault of the indigenous people. They're the victims of all this. In the case you describe, it's the people who are trying to push through some environmental preservation. They're just being much too aggressive about it. Am I right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Jay. Absolutely right. And the solution is that you don't need to reinvent the wheel, but you just really need to change your mindset. And what we're seeing from some conservation organizations supported by governments is that they just believe it's just pure belief. It's not something proven by the facts that all humanity is incompatible with nature, and this is not something that facts showed them. This is just the thought of the 19th century about nature, So you remember when there was this whole boom of industrialization and how modernity was so aggressive and the cities were taking out all the beauty of life and so on, that natural parks in the US began, right? To have places to contemplate nature and nature untouched by mankind and so on. And that's the belief of nature that has been informing and supporting fortress conservation since then. And since the 19th century, it has never been questioned. So departing from a way of doing things that does not come from the reality of conservation, but about a way of seeing life that made sense perhaps in the 19th century, but that today has no scientific basis for conservation, which is the pressing issue right now. And actually the demonstration of how flawed that belief is that the natural areas that are still preserved are the ones that have been inhabited by indigenous peoples, who were the ones able to develop a sustainable way to live in it. Because we, Western civilization, were not able to do it, Nature was everywhere in the world, and we decided to destroy everything and put cities in there. So the only thing we have left now is indigenous land, and we want to take over that one to achieve the conservation that we were not able to do on our own land. So it's very complicated and contradictory,
Yeah, contradictory. That's the word. And the important thing is to make a balance of it. So your work is cut out for you. But let me make a distinction. When you and I have talked in the past, and when I have talked to other representatives and officials from Project Expedite Justice, we're talking about people who are we're going to call them local people, victims who don't have a bad thought in their head. They're in the wrong place, the wrong time, and they are murdered or maimed, and that's because somebody is out there with really bad intention of doing genocide. violations of essential human rights. And a lot of what Project Expedite Justice is that. But this is different because the people who are trying to do this fortress environment model, they're not necessarily bad people. They may be a little insensitive, maybe a lot insensitive, but they're not out to murder anybody. They're not out to do genocide. So what you're doing now is way different than what a lot of people in Project Expedite Justice are doing in other places and what you were doing before, I think. So, what we have here is you can't get too angry at the environmentalists, except for their insensitivity. And so I suppose what you're doing or what you will do is to work with them and try to make them understand the consequences of their action, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I agree with you. And here we have to be very clear and cautious about the message because it can be easily be misinterpreted as going against environmental measures, which we are not doing. We care and we think that protecting the environment is essential. And as human rights lawyers, we also uphold the right to a clean environment that was recently declared, But what we are against are the ways in which this has been done, because first, they violate the rights of a lot of people, marginalized people that have been oppressed over and over again in history, but also you're doing it without need, because if it was the only way to do it and the best way to do it, I wouldn't say it would be better, but you would say that in a cost-benefit relationship, for some people, this would make sense. But that's the thing here. This is not necessary, and that's what we're trying to get conservation organizations and their supporting actors to understand. The thing that it's very hard. First, because it departs from a belief that they have sustained for more than 100 years. Second, because of that belief, and also because these parks go back at least 50 years in many places, if not more, since these countries in Africa, for example, were colonies. They've done things with indigenous peoples without giving them their place, and bringing them to the table and make them decision makers and so on. And now doing that requires to change their whole mindset, their whole operational situation. And these organizations also that are not human rights organizations, right? They're environmental organizations. So they think they're doing things right, but they're not. And then the consequences are terrible. And they thought these were necessary costs of conservation, or they were just a couple of isolated incidents, but minor in the big picture of biodiversity conservation. But when you start looking at different areas, and at Project Expedite Justice, we did a report mapping at least 10 protected areas in the world, you see that the model occurs exactly in the same way everywhere. And what that shows you is that this is not isolated, and there's a problem with the model. So it's not a problem of a couple eco guards going too aggressive and too committed to their jobs. It's a problem with the model, and that requires the organizations to understand that even if their goals are correct, the way in which they have done this since a very long time is wrong. It necessarily leads into human rights violations, and they have to accept it, acknowledge the responsibility, and deliver some sort of accountability, compensation, apologies, or something like that.
So it's more than just changing the model. It's going forward, and it's going backward. It's going backward and trying to make things right for the indigenous people whose rights, and I suppose that's a loose term in the context of indigenous people, whose rights have been violated and undermined. It's very interesting. So you go to them. Let's take a case study, if you don't mind, and let's call it a rainforest, or I'm not sure what the topography is like in the Maasai country in Tanzania, or Batwa in the Congo. But you have this in this very rainforest kind of place, and you're talking to an environmental organization which may be local. It may be in Tanzania, and it may be in Congo, but it may be from somewhere else trying to do good. Am I right? And the question is, so here, my name is Nicolás Süssmann, and I'm here to tell you how to make your model better. so that you don't violate rights. And I'm here to tell you how to compensate and be fair and reasonable and help the people that you have displaced. What steps do you urge them to take?
Well, that's the thing, Jay. That first, this was recently uncovered, and the way in which these organizations have addressed the situation is more of like an isolated incident situation or more of a government responsibility situation without really acknowledging their role in the situation, right? Of course, some of them have said, okay, yeah, some things happened and we didn't act properly, but they don't own up their responsibility as they should. So talking to them is very hard because they have been receiving complaints about these incidents since a very long time from the indigenous peoples themselves and more recently from human rights organizations supporting the indigenous peoples. And their answer usually is denial. It's like, this didn't happen, or this was an isolated incident, or this is the responsibility of the government, or this is just like rogue echo guards, but it's not a problem with the model, and so on. So it becomes really complicated to do it. So the main efforts right now we're doing is documenting the situation, showing that it actually happened and there is a role of these organizations in what's going on, because for the governments, of course, the governments have a responsibility, but that's not new. Governments have a responsibility for human rights always. But why are the governments doing that? Because external organizations with huge funding to set up these areas lobby the governments to do this, bring a lot of money into the country, and even if they're not directly managing the situation, although they're doing it in some places, they have a lot of influence, and the government is going to do anything they can to secure those resources, financial resources, but also to comply with environmental obligations, and also to get extra funding that comes from a lot of things surrounding protected areas, right? Because it's not just the protected area, but it's a buffer zone that you have surrounding it, where you have mining concessions, timber concessions, ecotourism locations. So there's a lot of money coming in that it's interesting for the government, that it's interesting for local actors. And of course, they want to secure that. So when they engage with indigenous peoples, they're not going to care about them, or they're just going to try to rubber stamp the situation to tell them they ask them, and then this whole situation happens. And when you confront them with the facts, they say it didn't happen or is isolated and so on, but they don't acknowledge the responsibility of being a wealthy actor in a situation where money is needed, and the influence you can have over that type of places, So I would like to say that at this point, conservation organizations are really owning up to their responsibility in the situation. But the reality is that not entirely, only some of them, and most of them are just denying the responsibility and treating the situation as isolated. And if you don't acknowledge that it's a problem with the model and you have to change the model, the results are going to repeat themselves, because this is not going to change by convicting a couple of echo guards every now and then.
Well, it's disappointing because in my mind's eye, in the mind's eye of most people, an environmentalist, an environmental organization, especially a well-funded environmental organization, is educated, is sensitive, understands the nature of the agreement by which we all live together on the planet, and for them to deny this, for them to act to contradict it, and not to take steps to do anything about it, it's a disappointment. So I guess the question I would ask you is, who do you approach? Because, for example, let's say there's an environmental organization in New York or London that's trying to work in Tanzania or Congo. And, they have a lot of money, millions and millions, and they're trying to do the right thing. And they're educated environmentalists, and you'd think an environmentalist would be sensitive to these issues. How do you reach them? Are they the ones to reach? And what do you say to them to connect up with their education and their essential sensibilities?
Well, it's very hard, to be honest, Jay. I here have to be very honest. They have been approached by many organizations in the past. not only PJ, that it's a newcomer to this ambit, but many organizations working on indigenous rights have come to them with evidence of what's going on, and what they got was dismissal or denial of the situations. When did this change? In 2019, BuzzFeed News discovered a lot of abuses happening in WWF managed areas around the world. And it was a huge scandal that actually had a reputational impact on them. Once that happened and they saw the reputation, because you frame it really well, Jay, you never think these organizations would be behind this because they're supposed to be the good guys, you know? And I don't want to say they're the bad guys, but they're doing bad things. And they have to change that. Once the reputation, that is one of their strongest assets, became compromised, they decided to commission a report by human rights experts investigating the situation. But that had to happen, and that had to achieve that degree of intensity for them to care. This was not new for them. It just came out in a very visible way. They even were called to Congress, and they had a hearing on their responsibility at the US Congress on the situation for something to happen. And they're taking some measures that they didn't took before, but they're not sufficient because they don't understand what human rights obligations mean. And yeah, human rights obligations might be very uncomfortable, you know, for the operation of this type of situations, because you have to ask a lot of people and you have to actually make sure that they understand, and you have to acknowledge that they are the owners of the land and they're just not interested parties and so on. And of course, this makes things very complicated for the usual operation and very uncomfortable, but it's the way to do it.
And then when you try to explain to them, you know, the true, what do you want to call it, the true human, the human standards here, the humanity point, and then you follow that with, hey, how about compensating some of these indigenous people? You got your checkbook out. I can imagine they're not too excited about writing checks to compensate people for damages and injuries that have happened as a consequence of their action. What happens then?
No, so it's very hard, Jay. It's very hard also because compensation for indigenous peoples wouldn't be solved just with signing a check. You know, you have to reinstate them in their lands. You have to grant them access to the places. You have to allow them even to hunt some species that for these conservation organizations is unacceptable. Although indigenous peoples know how to do it without sacrificing the diversity and the existence of the species. So it's a very hard thing to achieve because it goes rightly against what they have believed since forever. You know, which is the solution? Just keep pressing the organizations, keep showing that the evidence is there and that they have a role, and try to achieve some
going into the media, I expect.
Going into the media and even go into legal mechanisms, you know, that's an option. That's always an option, you know. When you damage someone, you always have the alternative to go to the courts. I don't think anyone would like to take these organizations to court because as you say, you would hope they would be reasonable and willing to sit down, negotiate, and find a solution with indigenous peoples. But so far, their commitment hasn't been the one required to actually remedy the situation. They want to fix some things going forward. Some of the measures they've taken are okay, but are not sufficient. But really speaking about reparations of past harms, that's something that hasn't been done yet. And I think it's part of the conversation.
So would you say that this, I mean, I get the feeling this is an uphill fight and there's resistance and there's not a whole lot of optimistic dynamic going on to make you feel that you know you're moving them in the right direction. So let's assume that. You can disagree with me, but let's assume that. How do you do this in the future? Is it just repetition? Is the court actions you talk about? Is it high profile media? How do you get them to come around and go through all the steps you've been talking about?
Yeah, I think it's everything, you know? I think it's everything. I think some groups should work on past harms, but what we're going to see in the following years is the creation of a whole lot of protected areas, you know? recently in December, it was approved that 30% of the world's surface should become protected areas by 2030. So what we're going to see is a boom in the creation of protected areas rushed by a deadline of 7 years. And that is very complicated, because if these processes without a deadline, without the rush, were very severe and violent, now that you have a 7-year deadline to do it, are going to get worse. That's what we anticipate. We hope not, but we don't have evidence to think that it's going to change. And that's why everyone take a look at it, You take them to the media. You also go to the donors. The donors for this conservation, right, they should play a huge role, and they receive lots of money from governments. So governments should know where their money is going to and should establish mechanisms for complaints to be processed. And these organizations have to understand that if they continue operating in this way, at some points governments are going to withdraw the funds. And I think that's the true way to hit it. But governments should commit to that, because governments do have human rights obligations. These organizations don't, but why should they be violating human rights if it's not necessary? But governments cannot tolerate that, for example, US taxpayer money is going into funding eco guards that are going to shoot at sight to indigenous peoples that are just trying to recover a cow that wandered into the park, because that's the type of violence we see.
So, what about the? I have my question. I do have my question. What about the indigenous people themselves? I mean, you investigate, like in any human rights violation, and although the channel is different, you're not necessarily going to go to the International Court Criminal Justice. That wouldn't be appropriate. Rather, you go to the funder, you go to the environmental organization at whatever level would be most effective. And by the way, the thought occurs to me that the schools are an appropriate place to talk about this, because a lot of the people involved in environmental organizations, NGOs, have gone to school. They've taken undergraduate, graduate degrees in environmental issues. And this is certainly something that should be taught in those schools. You might as well build these environmentalists to be more in tune, with the issue. But going a step further, so you're talking to the victims. You're talking to the people who are so unhappy about being pushed off their land and not being able to lead their lives, just as you do, as Project Expedite Justice does in the case of atrocities, in war zones and the like. So, is there any? And of course, you got to be very sensitive to them. You got to build up trust, right? You have to have them understand the process that you're involved in. Can you do that? Do you do that? A lot of these people have zero education. All they know is they've been separated from their land and their life. What kind of, what do you want to call it, therapy? What kind of advice can you give them to make them feel better? What kind of comfort?
Right. So we apply the same model. Jay, we cannot fix a problem of excluding someone by excluding them from the solution as well. And PJ works like this always, but with indigenous rights issues, it's even more important. Nothing is done about them without them. So we partner with them, we sit down, we listen to their needs, to how this will be fixed. And then we do what we always do. We train them in the information we bring. They train us on the information they have. And once we are peers, we start working together on collecting information, collecting evidence, and preparing whatever we need to prepare to go to the scenarios we need to go, settlement scenarios, court scenarios, and so on. We're just starting now. But there's a lot of knowledge in indigenous peoples. You just need to support them with the legal knowledge, that there's a huge gap there. They know what they want. They have the evidence. They're very well organized. But there's a gap in legal expertise, international legal expertise, to support them and get these conservation actors or the governments in the scenarios where where they can do it, because usually at the local level, the solutions are very limited. But when you bring a conservation organization to court or to settle in their home countries, the situation changes, right? There's more capacity to achieve something. And that's what we're trying to do right now. Just partner with them and see what it can get us to see if we can change the model of conservation to one that is indigenous centered, indigenous driven, and actually effective, because the results are much, much better when indigenous peoples are involved.
David Attenborough would agree, wouldn't he? He would say, look, the world is complicated, and when humankind starts getting in there and trying to fix it, it has to be super sensitive, because you can push one end of the blanket down too far and the other end comes up. You have to consider all the sides of the blanket if you are going to try to make the world a better place. Every single environmental and human element has to be considered. And over the past 100 years, we really haven't done that. And so it's a question of balance, isn't it? We have to balance all these considerations, and everybody has to know that their ultimate mission is to participate in the balance. Huh?
I think that's right, but I think the answer is before your eyes, and if you have some areas that are still biodiverse, nature reserves, and so on, you have to ask yourself why those ones remain like that and others don't. And the others are the ones where we live. And those things do not happen because they just do, and so on. There were people there who actually knew how to strike that balance and have stricken that balance since forever. So you don't need to reinvent the wheel. You just need to ask the ones who know how to do it, give them the resources they need to operate them, and that's it. That's it. Actually, what you see when indigenous peoples are kicked out is that all the illegal actors come in to fill the void. And then the remedy is much worse than what you're trying to solve in the first place.
You're kind of a communicator. You're kind of interpreting from one side of the blanket to the other, so that everybody understands what's happening on the other side. But I think this is a very noble purpose, a noble project, and I wonder whether it's just Project Expedite Justice that sees this trouble, this imbalance, and tries to take action, learn about it, and take action about it, or whether there are NGOs that are, I wouldn't call them counter-environmental NGOs, but NGOs that understand that it requires a little finesse, a little nuance. Are you the only one, or are there other people doing precisely the same kind of investigation and counseling to balance things?
No, definitely we're not the only ones. We're the newcomers to the block, actually. There's been organizations working on this for a very long time, on the advocacy and mixing it a bit with the legal part. We are one of the purely legal organizations, purely legal services organization focuses on there. I would say that's what we bring to the table with the expertise in international litigation. But there are great organizations, and I have to say that they have been so welcoming to us and just trying to collaborate to try to make this better. So I actually would give a shout out to them: Survival International, Minority Rights Group, Forest Peoples Worldwide, and of course indigenous organizations are at the forefront of this. And you just have to check, because they all know this and they're working on this, and indigenous peoples are very well organized. They just need a bit of extra support from us, but they're the ones who know. We just need to keep bringing attention to the situation, because if you ask me, before I was approached by these interested people in indigenous rights, I would have never thought that the environmental organizations were doing this type of thing. And it's not to bring a bad name on them, but people need to know where their money is going when they support these organizations, and hold them accountable, because I wouldn't feel happy to know that my, $10 monthly donation is going to fund eco guards that shoot at indigenous children,
Wow. Well, Nicolás, you must get a lot of gratification. Let me say also that your work on other kinds of issues, human rights issues for Project Expedite Justice, helps you do this, and helps you understand, the need to advocate and and balance and moderate our lives together on the planet. I admire you for that. We'll check back with you later for more. Don't leave town. Well, leave town, but let's talk again.
Of course, yeah. Thank you so much. As always, it's a pleasure.
The same here, Nicolás. Nicolás Süssmann from Project Expedite Justice. Aloha.
Thank you so much for watching ThinkTech Hawaii. If you like what we do, please like us and click the subscribe button on YouTube and the follow button on Vimeo. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and donate to us at thinktechhawaii.com. Mahalo.